Hello to all the amazing, cool, incredible, creative, talented, and let's be honest, beautiful artists out there. I hope everybody's having a perfect day. With this video, I kind of want things to be a little bit different. I want to approach things a little bit differently. The previous videos that I've posted are both these kind of, really planned out, thought out, produced things with lots of crazy edits and stuff like that. And even though I didn't have like a written out script that I was reading from, because the videos themselves were so planned out, I was constantly thinking in my head, what am I going to say? And I have to say this exact thing. I have to get this point across. So in the end, I was kind of just reciting stuff that I've already said in my head like a bazillion times. And when you get to the camera's rolling, it's like impossible to deviate from, all the talking points that you've already thought of. So the result is that, it's kind of felt really stiff to me, and like my personality was not kind of coming through. In this video, at least, I just want things to be a little bit more natural. So what I did is I got the idea for what I want this video to be, then went straight to the camera, hit record, didn't even give myself a chance to think about what I was going to say. So that way things are going to come out so much more genuine and natural, and it's going to be way, way better. And hopefully I'll have enough interesting things to say to make a good video. Or it'll be a horrible disaster train wreck thing. And that would be funny too. I've spent enough time on Instagram Reels to know that people love watching horrific, terrible disasters. For a while, actually, my feed was like literally just leg breaking videos, like one leg breaking video after another leg breaking video. It was like a weird subgenre that I got kind of hooked into. And then after that, for a while, I was actually getting like people being sucked up into factory machines. And that was pretty intense too. But no, so I just picked a video, a painting that I really like how it came out. And I think the process of painting it is pretty interesting. And there's, lots of stuff to kind of discuss and talk about while watching it. And also, because of the painting it is that I chose, it's a great opportunity to talk about another question that I get asked all the time. If I share a piece of art, no matter what, there's like a handful of questions that always get asked. And one of those questions is, do I paint with a reference? And I can't be more clear in answering this question than when I say, kinda, sorta, maybe, yes, no, it depends. And it really does depend. There's so many reasons why you would use a reference and why you wouldn't use a reference. All of the, variables are kind of valid for creating art. You could create a scale, of them. And on one end is like, you're using an exact reference, right? You want to paint something, very specific in reality. And it's not even just about being realistic, right? You can achieve realism without a perfect reference. But you're painting something unique in reality, right? That's when you really need that reference, right? You're painting somebody's face and you want to get all the features exactly right. You're going to use a reference. Like if you're painting a picture of your dying grandmother or something like that, you're going to want to use a reference to make sure that it looks like her. But if she's dying, maybe she looks terrible, diseased. So maybe then you want to use like idealized memory version of her. But then on the other end is not using a reference at all. And in that area, so much art lives in that area, right? Like most of abstraction is in that area. If you want just some separation from reality in your painting, you might not want to use a reference because they'll kind of lead you to include things that you wouldn't otherwise include if you didn't have one. Or if you do want to paint just, realistic, but you're not in the mood, too lazy to kind of create a reference or build up a reference. And you just want to trust your experience and instinct as an artist. And then, there's a middle area where maybe you just have a reference to kind of, inform you about certain things, right? Like, if you're painting a portrait, you just want to use a reference to kind of get an idea for how the light is going to cascade on somebody's face, or, how geometries are going to interact with an environment, but you're using your own features, right? You're sort of incorporating your own features into that. But this painting that I chose today is part of that side of the scale where, no reference whatsoever at all, purely from imagination. And I say purely from imagination, there is sort of another layer to this painting in that the thing that I'm painting is an established character. So there is like ideas of what they should look like, things that they should have, features that they should have, but I wasn't using like a physical reference ever. So for instance, I knew that I wanted them to have a hat, but it's not like I had a picture of a hat that I was copying. Yeah, I think it's pretty interesting to kind of see how it develops just straight off the top of your imagination. And it's this pretty long video. I think it's about 2 hours. So I think best to just hit play and keep talking about it as it plays so I don't run out of things to say. All right, let's go. All right, this painting. Actually, check this out. This is funny. Look at this. One attempt. Second, going to the canvas. Nope. Third attempt. Here we go. Surely now. 4. 5. I must start painting at 5. No. 6. It takes 6 attempts to kind of actually put something down on the canvas. It's so indicative of like, painting from imagination. Even when you know exactly what you're painting, those like first initial strokes are still pretty tough to kind of get down, right? You're still kind of apprehensive about, making a mistake from the very get-go, which is actually kind of funny, right? Because like in terms of painting, the first strokes, I mean, how important are they really? Like I always say, those first strokes they're not even going to be in the final painting. So it's not, don't stress about them too much. But I guess it's more about like having to live with a potential mistake, right? And surviving through a while of the painting, through a length of the painting with those mistakes in it. That can be tough for people sometimes. Because, the likely you're not going to get a chance to correct them maybe until later on in the process. But for this one, I kind of, didn't know where to start, didn't know what to do. Like I said, I have no idea really what I'm going to do. I have no actual full picture of what this character is going to be like. I don't even know how he's going to sit on the canvas, to be honest. So I picked an area that was going to be very general, not a lot of detail going on. And like I said, I knew I wanted him to have a hat. So I just chose the sort of shadow of the brim of the hat. And because it was a shadow area, I knew it was going to be very non-specific, not a lot of detail there necessarily that I need to worry about right away. So that's how I got into the character. That's basically what I'm painting right now, just sort of outlining the hat as it casts a shadow over his face. But a little bit about this character. So this painting is from a series of paintings that I did that I loved painting so much. It was so fun and interesting to me. And it was a series of Batman villains. Important for me in this series of paintings was to find a way to, subvert the expectations of people, not paint the characters exactly as people know them to look, right? Sort of finding a different way into the character, making it recognizable as the character, but turning it on its head a little bit, finding my own unique way of expressing all the character traits. And this particular one is a character called Clayface. Now, most representations of this character, at least like the most modern ones, the recent iterations of this character, he's kind of like a big amorphous blob mud creature. Here's a picture of him. I'll put a picture of him right here. And that's the way he looks for most of the time. It's sort of like, when you go get froyo and you got the cup and you go for the chocolate, and you're too lazy to do the freaking swirl thing. So you just like stare at it and you let the ice cream just pile up in the middle, and you're questioning your life as this mound of ice cream just builds up. That's exactly what he looks like. But I went and I did a little bit of research, and I took a peek at what this character looked like originally. What was his first iteration? What was his introduction like? And man, I got to say, it's so interesting to kind of compare those two worlds. Where, you know, I think modern day character design now we get a little bit extreme with it, you know, like the way he exists now is kind of like a chaotic monster, right? Lots of complexity, and, you know, it's a cool design, no doubt. Like, I do like the design. I think it's cool and interesting, and, you know, lots of great artistic interpretations that you could possibly draw out of that. But when you look at the original character design, to me, it just spoke so much more clearly. It was a lot creepier. It was a lot more simple, and I really connected with that. He had a lot more, you know, humanistic features, obviously, and that was something that I was very interested in incorporating in my depiction of that character. I think, you know, my introduction to the character actually was through the animated series. He did end up looking like this sort of amorphous, blobby character, but it was kind of a really cool, touching story where, you know, he was an actor and he was kind of like this big A-list, you know, popular actor, and he was aging a little bit. And as he started aging, he was not getting as many roles as he used to, as many primetime, you know, A+ roles as he used to. And he was struggling with that a lot. So he started to use this experimental cream that was kind of like a de-aging cream. And it brought his youth back like instantly. And it was going well for a while, but then some unwanted side effects started appearing. And it was something to the effect of like by the way, it's been so long since I've watched this, so I hope this is right. Excuse any errors. But it was something where he became dependent on the cream. And when he didn't have the cream, his face would start like melting and oozing. And I think there was either something like he couldn't afford the cream or there was none left or something like that. And he ended up turning, and maybe there was like a scene where he was just like slathering it all over his body or something like that. In the end, he turned into this like, you know, mushy, melty monster. And a cool side effect that was that he could kind of manipulate his face into, you know, any shape or form, or I guess his whole body, not just his face. So I was kind of attacking the pre-melty monster, this sort of transitionary period. But I also did really want to channel that sort of, you know, tragedy from that story. So you can see in the eyes already, you know, their eyes are very general, by the way. Pretty interesting to look at this process, you know, painting from imagination, very different than my other painting processes where, you know, I try and get exactly right away, you know, as quickly as I can, put the right color in the right place, that kind of thing, from the very first strokes. This one, so much more general, right? A lot less specific stuff going on, just giving myself an idea of where things are going to exist for the most part. But yeah, so the tragedy, that expression, something that I really wanted to bring out. And again, like I said, that sort of more humanistic quality to the character. But of course, I need it to look like the character. It can't just be like a brooding, you know, depressed guy. It's got to have it gives you some idea of the fact that it is Clayface. So I did want him to be droopy and messy and kind of gloopy and gloppy. So he is going to have like a sort of melty quality to his face in the end. But yeah, so just building out the shadow shapes here, really. And, you know, the color that I'm using is sort of like just a general, dark color. Not like anything very specific, because I kind of was questioning, well, what color do I make this guy? You know, typically he's kind of portrayed as like this brown mud, like clay, right? Like a sort of terracotta, not quite that warm, I guess, but like a yellowish, reddish clay. And I think maybe in the original reference that I saw, like his first appearance or something like that, I think he's skewed a little bit green. I can't remember though. Hopefully the picture that I showed corroborates my thought and it's not wildly different. But somehow I ended up with that greenish color you'll see eventually here. And I thought it was, I don't know, it was something a little bit more, it felt less store-bought clay, I guess, and more like, dirty, more like natural feeling somehow. Not that there wouldn't be natural reddish clay, obviously, but it brought a different idea to my head than like clay pots, like the clay in pots, for example. Yeah, so, as I'm building this out, I'm thinking about number one thing is lighting, and you can see that I think I actually started painting this with the intention of it being a sort of straight on perspective, like he's looking straight into the camera. But you can see kind of is like tilted a little bit now, right? It's kind of edged into the 3/4. And as I did that, I kind of decided, okay, so the light is going to be mostly coming from, the right side of the painting, right? And you can see I've sort of just given myself a general idea of where the shape of the nose, the shade of the nose is going to be, and the sort of cheek here, right? Often you'll have like a dark sort of line that separates, or that's like the furthest point from the light source. And then it continues to curve around, and maybe you pick up some more balanced light or some secondary light source. So that's why I left that part blank on his cheek right there. Yeah, I think as far as like other things that I was really interested in incorporating was, he had a trench coat, that was another thing that I was thinking. Obviously the hat, like I mentioned before, that I really wanted to make sure I put in there. The expression, and then also, kind of just getting, because he was an actor, in the show that I know, the animated series that I know, I think that's now become like his origin story for the most part. And also in the original sort of iteration of the character, he was also an actor, I believe. I believe it was a little bit different though. It's not that he was de-aged or he was aging and using a de-aging cream. I think it's just that he was putting on makeup to look like other people and then killing his acting competition or something like that. Something weird like that. Or maybe that's completely wrong. Somehow I have that in my memory. Yeah, so the expression was important for me. And getting that Hollywood vibe. That was it. That's what I really wanted to get. Because he's an actor, and I kind of have this, I'm going to say it's like, 50s, 60s, probably when he was introduced, maybe even 40s, I'm not sure. But sort of, it gives me this golden era Hollywood type vibe. And I just really wanted to channel that. That also helped me kind of inform the features on his face a little bit. I wanted that more square jaw, sort of leading man type vibe about him. But you can see a pretty simple structure to the face, very generic, nothing really specific, hard to tell. It'd be hard to say who this is, for example, right? If I was painting a person, because everything's so generic. A lot of shadow from the hat, right? That really actually helped me get into this painting very quickly, is, all the shadow that's being cast by the hat. I knew that a lot of this part was going to be dark. So it was easy to fill in very quickly, right? And, big tip always is like, the more paint you can get onto the canvas quickly, the better it is, right? The easier it is to kind of move forward, the more that's on there. Here, the shadow from his chin. So again, another part where I think I was just painting, the shadow being cast on his chin from the light coming from above him. And now it also turned out to be, I just feel this sort of turned body at the same time. It gives this sort of interesting kind of, cool pose almost. So, that kind of stuff, letting the paint kind of inform you as to what you're going to do. So key, I think, to painting. Part of what makes everything so enjoyable, really. I mean, how unbelievably boring is it to just, I shouldn't say that. That's not fair, because there are people who love doing that, and that's totally valid. But for me personally, it's like, how boring is it to just paint exactly, what you see all the time? It's so wonderful Not that that isn't interesting sometimes, of course, it's awesome sometimes, but so cool to kind of break out from that and just let your imagination kind of take over. So here started adding some color to the face. And you can see how it's sort of like a questioning in between period of the color where, it could be the shadow for, I think that's initially how I started, is, picking the shadow for like a redder, sort of warmer color. It definitely looks like it'll edge in that direction. But towards the end, I was just kind of, really trying to channel that cooler kind of greenish quality to the clay. So it'll be interesting to see how that kind of develops and pops out. And staying really dark, because that's where all of your flexibility exists in a painting, is in the darkness, right? So easy to kind of mess around and move around dark areas of a painting. And you kind of, it's not until you like get those lighter colors in there that you kind of lock in and you make it difficult to change things. Not that you still can't, but it becomes harder and harder to change things the more you build up in terms of value. So just filling out that shadow shape there, and question now, because it bleeds in so much. Those values are very similar to each other. How deep is this shadow going to go? And I was thinking, one of my main sort of mental notes here at this point was like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if like the shadow was like just all over his face, like up until here, and then you just had like these piercing eyes kind of popping out of that shadow. So that was kind of my initial thoughts about it. It doesn't quite develop out exactly that way, but it's sort of, a good jumping point for me creatively there. So it's kind of interesting, figuring out how to get across the droopy, drippy, goopy, gloppy quality on his skin here. And I had painted another portrait a little bit earlier than this, which was basically just like a red. My favorite colors to use are these reds. And, I have so much experience using them, and I feel very flexible about using them that it just felt like I could, get my ideas out very easily in those colors. And I had painted a while ago, completely not thinking about this character or anything like that, just a separate thing, a red sort of mud monster type, not monster, but mud man type portrait, where he was very like droopy, almost like I was thinking of like a candle sort of melting into a face kind of situation. And, I was thinking about that painting a lot here. It was like a great practice for, understanding how drips would work and how you could, build out certain forms in certain areas to give that sort of drippy quality. And here you can see I'm really defining that sort of shadow. You can see it on my face here a little bit, right? There's like this dark area. You have the main highlighted area, and then this sort of secondary light source here, or maybe a bounce light from my shirt. So that's what I was doing there, right? I was creating this dark rim on the cheeks, and then the secondary light source on the outside of the cheeks. And, when you're painting from imagination, you're basically, a lot of the times you're going to choose, well, what are my favorite things to paint? And then you're going to incorporate those things, right? Sort of like when you're looking for references, one of the traps that you can fall into as an artist is like looking for a very narrow range or very specific kind of reference. And it sort of limits what you're painting, right? You're always painting something that you like. So important to break out of that sometimes. You don't always, painting something new, that's where real like creative development happens. Painting something new for the first time is where, technical progress really happens. But here, it's pretty evident that I'm choosing things that I know will come out, or things that I enjoy painting. I'm leaving the space here, like I said, for that sort of bounce light or something. And I'm also gonna, thoughts in my head already of like incorporating like very bright rim lights. And that kind of bright sort of highlight out there really gives you an opportunity to be real thick with the paint too, which is something that I always look for chances to be real thick, laying the paint down. Here, lightening the color even more. And you can see now I'm kind of staying pretty neutral, actually, right? It's not very red. It's not very warm like how we're used to seeing him. It's definitely cooler, right? A lot more dirt, I think, is kind of what I had in my mind, like natural in the earth kind of, backyard type clay. Yeah. And, because of the nature of that face, like I was saying before, it's very drippy and stuff like that, made it kind of easier, I think, for this because it does have that separation from reality. So it was easier to paint from pure imagination here. Lots of chances to be messy with how you're putting things down. And like I said before, letting the paint kind of direct you a little bit. And also, one of the questions I also had was, what's the texture that I'm looking for, right? Because the depictions of this character have mostly been, pretty cartoonish. It's a comic, right? So they've been in that sort of comic world. And at times, everything will look flat a little bit, right? Just because of the level of detail that they go into and, printing limitations and things like that. The fact that they need to paint them very quickly and things like that. So sometimes you don't get a great indication of what they should look like texture-wise, especially a character like this, right? Where there's like a big question. So, you could think, oh, it's clay. It's supposed to be very matte and very like dull kind of surface. But for me, I was thinking of melted quality. And I was also thinking about like that story about him putting on the cream like that on his face. And I was thinking, oh, maybe it would be cool to make it very like a sort of glossy kind of thing, or maybe a combination. So that was another area, another kind of direction that I was pushing myself into, a creative choice that I was deciding to make. That's an interesting thing to talk about, huh? And that's something that really grinds my gears these days is, something I see more and more often now is people getting really up in arms about characters and making sure that they're, maintained in a very strict representation, right? They have to look like this. This is the way the character looks, and you can't deviate from that. And people get upset all the time when you're painting a character or you make a character and you do something different, right? You try something out and they're like, well, that's not right. That's not the way he looks. And, it's fine to like feel that way sometimes, but to kind of get really like, religious about maintaining the look of a character in every representation of it, that's, I think that's so bad for art and the progress of a character in general, right? Obviously, all these characters have been changed so many times over the years. And, they've gone through lots of, mutations, lots of, interpretations from individual artists that have, added things, changed things, and have made it the character that people know now. It's great to be accepting to that change. Let art kind of breathe a little bit. And if there's I also think about that. Like I remember having a discussion with somebody about that with like, gender bending in certain characters, and that's a big sort of hot controversial topic these days. Like don't change the gender of the character. The character's supposed to be this, but and I get that for like the character existing that way in people's minds, fine. But to say that you can't experiment with that or try it once as a diversion, as a tangent from like, how you typically experience the character, I think that's, that's crazy to not think that that's interesting, right? To explore everything for a character, right? I think that is, everything should be open for the artist to kind of try and see what happens. Sometimes it'll be horrible failures, but you never know like the goal that you could strike by doing something unexpected. So still building out forms, adding lighter and lighter values um, to the sort of clay texture of the skin. You can see that now what were very simple indications of where features are, giving myself a little bit more topography to the face, right? A little bit more, of the bumps that might appear, the sort of drips where I'm planning to put drips and stuff like that. The nose, very, very like not very crisply shaped, right? Very kind of blending more into the face than maybe you'd naturally expect it to do. Um, and interesting thing about this, I always find painting characters that have makeup or some kind of like different skin texture, something separate from just what you'd expect a human to have. Unless you know a human, maybe you know a human like this. But no, when you're kind of doing something, I find it most often painting, references where people are wearing makeup, like, effects makeup on. It's so challenging sometimes to make it look, to sort of achieve the same sort of realism when you're painting somebody with makeup. Obviously, if you have like a perfect reference and you're just literally copying it, you're going to get the look of that person in makeup. But there's also an opportunity with you as the artist to go a level deeper and separate that idea of them wearing makeup, and now they're actually that thing, right? They're existing as what the makeup is supposed to make them look like. And here it's an even more interesting, difficult task when you don't even have a reference at all. And the real problem is like making it look, giving it variety and color, and not making it look like a sort of two-tone, black and white kind of desaturated thing. So, it's because it's so easy when you're painting from imagination to fall into a very sort of boring range, or very simple range, I guess, of just dark to light, and you're not varying the temperatures enough within that range. Within the value range, you're getting appropriate values, but maybe you're not playing around enough with temperature deviation, right? So you want to make sure that you're still incorporating enough of a wide color gamut to make it look like it's existing in reality, right? So that's one thing that I'm also thinking about here a lot. Subtly different highlight color on the lip there than maybe there is on the nose, and then maybe there is on the cheek as well. We can see very smooth build up, right? Definitely, trying to still get the general shape of the face before I really start, deviating and going into real bizarre sort of surrealistic elements of like the melty quality of it. And, one of the first indications of that melty quality is right there on the lower lip, where there's a line sort of connecting the highlight area of the lip to the highlight area of the chin. And I'm building out a little sort of pool on the chin there. It's hard to see right now. It's still very very low contrast in those areas because I don't want to commit to anything perfectly yet. But that's an indication. It's such a great area to look for things. I learned that from that other sort of sketch that I talked about that I was doing, the mud man kind of thing, where if you can connect things over an aggressive shadow, it's such a great effect to really make you understand that there's dripping going on, right? It could be difficult to sort of show that when it's just dripping, a sort of bright value area over a bright value area. So it's the shadows that really indicate to you how form is how it's dripping across form. So here it going over the shadow on the lower lip that's a real key area. And I'm also thinking about over the eyes. I'm thinking about dripping off of the nose, right? Those are the other two big shadow areas that you could kind of bisect or cross over. to kind of accentuate that drippy quality. But there are also tricky areas because those are parts of the portrait that maybe you want to maintain, right? You want to keep those pure. You want the eyes to be able to speak as clear as they possibly can, and maybe you don't want to interrupt them with little drips. So I'm having those questions, thinking about those questions right now. And the eye color was another thing I was really thinking about. What do you make the eyes? Are they human eyes? Do they have some other color, right? Like in the modern iteration of him, he's very inhuman eyes, right? Even the shape of them is very inhuman. But ultimately, I ended up deciding, if I want the emotion to really speak through, if I want it to be, as relatable as possible, because the character kind of has that tragic, relatable story that we can get into, we can understand, how he's feeling. I thought, okay, that's a moment in the portrait that I want to preserve as human as possible. So I thought, okay, the eyes I'm going to maintain as human as possible. I'll probably make the shape slightly different, right? The outline shape of them, I'm going to, muddy up a little bit, kind of blur out a little bit as I imagine the dripping over his eyelids. But the general sort of structure of the eye, the fact that there's going to be like a white sclera, the whites of the eyes are going to be there, and that he's going to have, an iris and a pupil. That was important for me to maintain because we all know windows of the soul, right? If you want to know somebody, look them straight in their peepers. And that's how you're going to be able to kind of read their emotion the best. So, and very open too, right? Like I said, I want that sort of, shock tragedy almost, this sort of like, channeling 1,000-yard stare kind of thing. So very open eyes, like very expressive eyes. And here we go. Again, it's reading very white to us because of a lot of things, right? Because we understand them to be whites of the eyes, right? We have an anticipation of what they should look like already. And also the sort of value separation between those eyes and everything else, and the temperature separation. Obviously, they're the coldest part of the whole painting so far, right? So definitely, still maintaining these basic principles of realistic painting, and not making the whites of the eyes super white or too neutral of a color or too warm even. And that was one thing that I wanted to eliminate kind of was, you might have this temptation to put the tear duct in there as very warm. And, that gives you a cool, realistic quality oftentimes. But it also will lead you to the direction of thinking this is a person in makeup. So that was a choice to make sure I'm leaving that out, because I don't want it to look like, oh, that's just where they avoided, putting the makeup on. You can see here on that eye, on the right side of the painting there, on the lower lid, already thinking about putting a sort of a drip there. Not interrupting the eye, but just dripping off of the bottom of the eye, almost thinking, okay, tragedy. This character is sad, right? There's a depressed quality to this character. Maybe he's not crying, but there's some indication of, mirroring a metaphor for a tear or something. Another part of a question that I had that I was really thinking about was, and it was sort of like a general thought that I had for every feature on his face was, what maybe it's cut out, because the modern iteration of the character, again, is like the mouth feels like it's a cut segment from a greater mass, right? Sort of like you cut the mouth out almost, as though you were cutting it from clay. And I was thinking about that with the mouth here, and especially, as it gets to the corner, like does that sort of travel further than you might expect it to? And it just looks like a cut in clay, maybe, kind of. And how am I going to deal with that? But now that I have most of the form kind of built out, and I'm happy with the way that it's kind of developing. Now I'm starting to get in with those brighter highlights, right? Remember, it's so hard to change. Once you get to those brighter values, it's very difficult to change things. So now I'm feeling confident enough to get in there with that level, that bright level where it becomes permanent almost. I know this is going to be here. I'm not going to change it too much anymore, or I don't plan to, at least. And yeah, lots of texturing going on here, right? And it's kind of a cool. I don't want to say like study, but it's definitely like, you get study qualities from it. Maybe it could be a cool, little thing to do yourself as practice. Because one of my main sort of suggestions for people who are just starting out painting is to try and separate it from drawing as much as you can. Because I think most of us have come from drawing, right? Drawing is so accessible to everybody, right? Everybody, I shouldn't say everybody, but most people have access to a pen or pencil, right? And they can find a surface to kind of draw on. Most of us have started with crayons in our hands as bait. So we all have some kind of background in drawing. And most people getting into painting are coming from a sort of drawing idea, right? Their interest has been sparked by drawing. So it can be easy to transfer a lot of the idea of lines into painting. And there's definitely a place for that. But to really kind of break free from the constraints that they may put on you is to think about it as clay, right? As though you're modeling clay. And as you're, putting in dark values, you feel the sensation of cutting away from a mass of clay. Or as you're putting in brighter values, you feel the idea that you're building up layers of clay. And you're kind of really molding something that's there. And as I'm texturing the face and putting these bumps and drips and stuff like that, I really can channel that sensation that I'm molding things. And here, a drip coming off of the chin, very separated from the shadow that the chin is casting onto the neck. Great visual interest area. Also kind of adds a sense of action maybe, or movement as that's sort of actively dripping down. And now kind of, this is where this is a treacherous part here, because I want this to be a bright secondary or a bright light source, right? Coming onto his cheek there. So interrupting that with what's going to be dark shadows for, texture on the face, on the drippy face. Very, very, lots of opportunity to go wrong here and spend another 30 minutes trying to just correct that little bit. But yeah, so cool. That's a really interesting, I think that'd be a great little exercise to just, paint out of imagination an amorphous blob of clay with lots of different sort of surface texture, bumps and protrusions and things like that to really help yourself channel the sensation of, how you build out forms with paint. Here we go, going in again, changing the temperature with the light, making sure that I'm not just varying value, but also changing the temperature there. And of course, when you have competing light sources, another sort of visual interest that you can create is by making them different colored light sources. I think we've all seen the paintings, probably done the paintings of like blue light, red light, and it just gives you this real sort of obvious roadmap to follow to kind of create a convincing face. Give yourself very convincing depth very quickly. But yeah, definitely cooler, right? Definitely a cooler light. I'm thinking, bluer light, maybe even like a phthalo blue on the light, and then a white highlight over the phthalo blue really kind of gives you that glowing kind of feeling. That phthalo blue is a great phthalo blue is a great color to kind of get a bloom effect, not bloom effect, but like a sort of glowing effect almost of the light, because of how, I don't know, it has this very like prismatic quality to it, iridescent. Like it's something about that color is very, it's one of those very like, you almost feel like it's metallic and has lots of interesting reflection going on inside of it. And also on the other side of the face, building out the light, the secondary light. Here it's like, you know, these are where you have questions of like, what am I doing? I just freaking ruined this whole dang painting by putting in this huge bright highlight here. And, you know, we also trust the process kind of thing. And, you know, I felt that way now. I feel that way, even looking at it. I'm sorry, I felt that way painting it, but I even feel that way now. Like looking at it like, oh man, that is too aggressive, right? I missed some, I can't separate it that much. There needs to be some edge refinement going on in there. So that's what I'm doing, you know? Refining the edges, building out the values in between the highlight on the side of the face and the forward-facing face. But also cooler, right? Sort of, you have this sensation of, you know, cool as the cheeks recess, and then warm as they're brought forward. Warmer. Obviously, it's not super warm, but warmer as it's brought forward. You know, another indication of just painting from imagination where, you know, you're using things that you know typically work, right? As things recede, you can make them cooler, and it kind of exaggerates that effect very often if all the forward-facing stuff is more warmer, right? Gives you a sense of depth, helps that sense of depth. Yeah, very, very fun to paint that. You know, I got to go back to that series. I think I painted like, I think I ended up doing like 4 or 5 in this series, and they were all very fun, super fun to, you know, figure out different ways to approach characters. Really helps, you know, your imagination and your creative outlet. It's a very good creative outlet, because it takes some of the burden off of your imagination, right? There's that great quote where, you know, no limitations is the greatest limitation of all, where all opportunity ends up being more of a, you know, constraint than anything else. It's a resting to just be able to paint anything you want. And you think, well, what do I even do? So to have this sort of jumping board of like, oh, this is a character. These are the established parameters by which that character exists. How do I get into that and find my own voice in that character? Now, this was kind of funny. As I was painting, you know, whenever you're painting a portrait, there's always that moment where it's like, oh, there they are. There's that person. I see them in there now. And the portrait kind of starts staring back at you a little bit. And here I was like, dang, I'm kind of painting Woody Harrelson. It looks like Woody Harrelson to me. Like, very much looks like Woody Harrelson, which is so interesting. I think something about the eye. It's really the eyes and the nose, I think. Maybe even like the square jaw. I'm trying to think of what he actually looks like. But yeah, just kind of curious, right? If that can just pop out to you. Here again, you know, the mouth, very tricky area. Lots of opportunities to do stuff there with the dripping stuff. But how much do you want to interrupt, you know, a key feature that helps with understanding and recognizing what it actually is, you know, that there's a face underneath there. And, you know, taking darker values here, again, cutting away, have the sensation that I'm cutting away from the clay that's there, creating more visual interest, more topographical variation. I think the other characters, there was another one that I did that I was really, really happy with, which was Mr. Freeze painting. I really liked that one. That one came out really well. But that one was also very like traditional. in a way. Not very different, nothing very interesting going on there other than representing the character as he exists. And that one I did paint with a reference. That one I actually took a reference of my own face wearing these goggles that I had gotten. And that was pretty fun. I'll show a picture. This is Mr. Freeze painting here. Very fun to paint. And all these characters, you know, so it's so easy to like dismiss, let's say, comic books, anime, and all that kind of art. It's so easy to kind of think of it as like exclusively like fan art, you know, type of lower level art in some way, right? There's easy to kind of find that stigma. But man, I'll tell you what, some of my favorite artists in the modern era exist in that world, and they come from that discipline. And, you know, some of the artists that really inspired me to even start painting came from that world as well. You know, I think, who are we but a sort of accumulation of all the tastes that we've experienced throughout our lives. And so much of that develops when we're young. And what we're exposed to when we're young is, you know, this kind of media. And, you know, definitely want to work on dispelling any kind of pretension that, you know, you can't paint these kind of things, that this is low quality art, or, you know, it's not as deserving as a, you know, painting that you might see in a typical exhibition or a museum or whatever. Yeah, Bill Sienkiewicz is an artist, actually, that whenever anybody asks me who are my favorite artists, it's so hard. That's a difficult question. And there's like literally 800 trillion people that, you know, you could say. And you know, there's more of a worry of like leaving people out than including them. So typically you go for like the historical, you know, easy answers, you know, Sargent, duh, he's my favorite. Klimt is like another one I always kind of call to. And but Bill Sienkiewicz is a living one that I often always say, just because, you know, like I was saying, that when I was a kid, that is the art that I experienced so much and sort of helped me develop a lot as an artist. Yeah, just like looking at I remember getting trading cards, Marvel trading cards, with his art on it, or just seeing his art in those trading cards and thinking, dang, that's so freaking cool. That's something I would like to do, to emulate. And definitely is like a, you know, modern, or still to this day, a present influence on me. Here, coming in with that, like I was saying earlier on, you know, great opportunity to find thick strokes in these highlights on the cheeks here. And I'm already starting to put those in. And it's, you know, where I was worried before that the separation was too drastic, now I can really start to feel things working out. And yeah, it's phthalo blue really helps. It's such a great light source, you know, phthalo blue mixed with white. What a wonderful sort of bright, cool light source mixture. And now here, you know, this is the best part of painting, right? If you could start every painting in this moment, oh, my life would be perfect. I feel like, where everything's kind of set up for you, and now you just go crazy. You know, you see how far you can push it, because the risk of mistake, of grave mistake, where you're going to ruin things, is almost gone at this point. And all you're doing now is like making choices on how you want to improve it. So fun, you know, and it's mostly just putting in those very final sort of highlights. How much do you want to build out certain features and, you know, certain gloopy areas on this face. And because I've committed in my mind mentally, I want it to be, you know, a little bit shiny or a mixture of texture. I'm going to have so much opportunity to put, you know, really nice kind of specular highlights to show that there's something very liquid there, very reflective there. You know, beginner's tip. When it comes to, or I guess painting for imagination tip, something to just know. When it comes to surface texture, the more matte a surface is, the more gradual the highlight transition is going to be. Right? You're not going to have those bright or drastic separations between values. And the more reflective, the more sleek or liquid, let's say, because liquid is very reflective, right? More reflective a surface is, the tighter the highlight is going to be, and the more drastic the separation from the surrounding values is going to be. So you can see here right now, the face reads very matte because there's not a lot of, drastic separation between highlighted areas and shadow areas, right? It's all the transitions are very smooth. There's not a lot of crisp, hard edges yet, except for that, side of the face there where we have that secondary light source blasting him. And you can see, as I progress, I'm going to start adding in those specular highlights, even here, right? How is that secondary light source affecting the face as it turns more and more and more in, But also, that highlight you just put there on that side of the face, on this side of the face here of the painting, just one stroke, very thick. It's amazing how well that kind of stuff reads. Adds so much visual interest. One of the big kind of holes you can fall into when approaching realism, painting realism, is that you're thinking about everything as like grain in a developed photo almost, or grain pixels on a screen of a photo, where everything is very kind of blended into each other to a degree, and you're never finding these bold moments to kind of break from reality somewhat and add visual interest. And it doesn't look unrealistic, right? It still lives in the world of realism. It's just not, perfect realism. It's not photorealism, I guess. And because the secondary light source is kind of spreading across, it's also hitting just a bit of that nose out there that I want to show off and accentuate, really kind of help develop that depth of the painting, or the depth in the nose, right? The nose protruding and the rest of the face being recessed behind it. Committing to that drip over the shadow on the under lip there. And again, cool opportunity to just mess around here, with the lip. You don't have to be something, because that's not an instance where you want to be careful where the lip ends, right? Very, very common beginner mistake also is having that lip extend really wide out and you get this crazy smile. So here's an opportunity where it doesn't really matter so much, right? Because we're buying in to the quality of his skin being very malleable, that maybe it's supposed to be that far. So, again, cool, great. Honestly, this is like a cool experiment for a beginning artist, maybe, because there's so many things that, you could do wrong that might function within this painting. And you kind of have the opportunity to see what works and what doesn't work in terms of, realism. But yeah, very, very fun. Super, super fun. Something I encourage everybody to do. Paint from imagination, see where you get. And it's amazing how many people don't do that. That's something that's kind of, when you get a formal education, that's one thing that can sometimes be left behind or lost a little bit. Not that it's the obligation to do that, right? I mean, when you're getting a formal education, you're probably intending to learn how to paint from life. You're intending to learn how to paint as realistic as you possibly can from a, representative light, as a reference. But definitely important to experiment with painting from your imagination. Here on the nose, super satisfying, right? Always one of my favorite parts to look for a highlight, even on my face right here. Boing, you can see that really bright highlight on the tip of the nose. Something I didn't want to lose, even though the reason the highlight is there is very different from a normal sort of realistic portrait, right? Normal person, because in a normal person, the nose on the skin on the nose is very tight, right? Makes it a lot shinier than the rest of the face usually. But this is super fun, this part right here, just adding in those specular highlights. You know, this is where your experience as an artist, you know, having painted thousands of portraits before, and lots of portraits of, you know, moisture on people's faces, or, you know, water or whatever, right? Lots of sort of similar kind of areas or similar kind of reference to this. It really helps you kind of try to understand where certain things are going to occur in the portrait, where all these specular highlights are likely to be. And here, for instance, great place to look for highlights in a portrait right under the lower eyelid, where the shape of the face starts protruding outward, and depending on the person, can sometimes really push forward right after the eyelid there. So again, helps us understand the shape of the face there. And just building those out, you know, rolls of clay I'm imagining right now as I'm putting in the highlights. It's amazing how much that top layer really helps you define the shape of certain things. And just continuing on, very chaotic. You know, this is the beauty of painting without a reference. You can be very chaotic with it, moving all over the place, not very, you know, not worrying about being super specific. Everything has to be exactly here and pinpoint accuracy. Again, letting the brush kind of take over a little bit. Excuse me. I'm sick. Excuse me for my voice, by the way. I didn't even say. My nose is very stuffy these days, and I'm sort of like a weird in-betweenness where I'm just like for like a couple days, I feel like I'm getting sick, but I haven't quite gone over the hump of like, oh, I'm sick. So fingers crossed, I'm just stuffed for no reason. But very, you know, look how much more convincing this is now with these little highlights here, huh? And really helps also, you know, I'm starting to really, it almost, because they're so drastically different, it's making me understand a difference in the darker values as well, right? I'm really pulling out some of those temperature shifts that I was talking about before and really seeing more realism there. Very treacherous area here too. Boy, could you go overboard with this? And maybe I did a little bit, right? Temptation to just, because it's so satisfying to put these in. Oh man, you just want to plop them in all over the place and just go nuts with all the highlights. And here, you know, reinforcing, huge, right? Never think that you're done by just doing one stroke. You know, it's we're all looking for that magical one stroke highlight, boom, and you got it. But sometimes you don't get it, and sometimes you say like, oh well, I want to accentuate this even more. So sometimes you need to go in there with a little bit of extra paint to really push that highlight out. And also, you know, you're correcting some of the lower values, right? Not the brightest values anymore, but putting in lower values to make sure that I have a good transition of values to, you know, help understand all the intricacies of the texture of his gloopy gloppy face. This would be a fun reference to build out, actually. Would have been cool to, you know, do the makeup and actually make this a reality and then take a picture of it. That would be kind of a cool experiment too. Painting from reference and then painting from imagination and seeing the differences that you come away with. Maybe that's a future video. But here, you know, like I said earlier, you know, the more that's on there, the more information you have to kind of go to the next step, right? The easier it is to kind of tree out, to kind of vein out into different directions, and, you know, different things will say to you, oh, hey, maybe this would be a cool idea, or maybe that would be a cool idea. So, you know, listening to the stuff that I'm putting down there, and not just my initial thoughts from my imagination. Chin highlight, here, very good area to kind of develop some interest visually. Like I was talking about before, that drip over the lip was something I was really thinking about, and the highlight on the chin next to that drip going over the lip, that's a great complex area of light and shadow that really helps kind of build out the form of the face. And I'm looking at this now and thinking, okay, what are the things that I really set forward to do at the beginning of the portrait before I started painting? Like, what were my like parameters for a successful painting? And I think about, the expression. That was number one for me. Really get the human quality, the tragedy in his face, and I'm thinking, okay, did I achieve that? And I think there's something there. It's subtle, and that's key, right? Sometimes being subtle is much more effective than going overboard, right? If you made him really pouty and eyebrows just completely up, that might be too much, right? And it might be pandering. One of the greatest quotes that I ever heard, my teacher told this to me in music school, and I'm not sure that it's his quote. I'm sure it exists. Whenever you hear a quote, it's probably been said 6 trillion times before by other people. But the quote is like, you don't want to tell people what to think. You just want to give them information on which to build their own feelings and their own thoughts. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do here. It's just give a subtle indication of what he might be thinking, of what might be going on in this character's life, or what his experiences might be. And then you as the viewer, then you have the opportunity to kind of build out your own story. Magical highlight moment in the eyes. Oh, so cool. Is it realistic? That's the question, because the shadow from the brim of the hat is quite deep, and there's quite a bright highlight in the eyes. I imagine if I had a real reference here, I might not be able to do exactly that. Look at this. See? Look. Oh my God. If you look on the right side there, I somehow picked up turquoise on my hand, and I put it on the canvas, and I created that little bloob. Very annoying. Very, very annoying. But thankfully, I had already planned to do this with a background, so easy to cover up. More specular highlights around the eye, kind of giving moisture to the eyes. Now, this is a really fun part here, too, is actually putting in the sort of secondary highlights, creeping into the shadow areas, right? Really, really helps kind of build out the form underneath the hat, understanding that this is something pushing out, but is covered by something else, right? There's a shadow cascading over something that's forward facing. Is really great depth trick there. But here's a really great tip on how to get rid of areas. Just take a cloth with mineral spirits or any kind of solvent, really, I guess, would work. And just kind of give yourself tight little circles around the offending area. Definitely don't want to spread it too much, because then you're going to start to really smear it across all over the place. You just want to kind of go in, clean it in that little area, come back, clean it again in that little area, and just keep taking it off more and more and more and more. And look, it's amazing how much it just, boom, disappears if you get it quick enough. But here I kind of built out the ears, and, big ears. I was really thinking initially, like, the ears were just going to be like a rain of mud, of clay coming down on the sides of his face there. But, ended up just making them kind of bigger, more droopy ears than anything. And if you look at the right side ear, it's very flat, like the values there is very, only a couple values there. It's very flat looking, not very three-dimensional, doesn't have a lot of depth to it. And I keep it that way through the whole painting. And it's not because I didn't see it. It's not because it's a mistake. It's not because I didn't know what to do there. It's because I thought, oh, that's so interesting and bizarre. And, it just adds something to the painting. And, I always like to say, include a UFO in your painting, something that's like people will see and be like, what are you doing there? What is that? Did you mean to do that? Is that a mistake? Have them questions, The more questions that the audience, that the viewer asks, the more interested they are in the painting, believe it or not. The more work that a viewer has to do with your painting, sometimes the better the painting is, the better the experience that they're going to have with your painting is. Here I'm starting to build out the hat, right? And, think about the form. This is probably the most challenging part for me because I don't have a lot of hat experience, I guess. I found out in painting this. Some idea of what I wanted to do. Obviously, I wanted, some kind of, some translucency. Like I have this idea that the light is going to be really blasting that hat on the top of it. And so it's something I felt, I wanted something to kind of peek through, some warmth to peek through the brim of the hat there. So it's giving us this like little warmth, bloom of warmth kind of pushing through the fabric of the hat. And then of course getting darker as it recedes behind the head, behind the ear. But yeah, hats can be tricky because same reason that tops of the heads can be tricky, right? How big do you go, right? Sometimes you create like Megamind with people by accident. You give them these giant craniums. Looks like their brains are like trying to escape from their skull. And the hat is the same thing, right? It's so tricky to kind of figure out where it should end and how big should it be? What's a reasonable size for the hat? And I think I kind of ended up doing like maybe a little bit of an oversized feel to it, especially in the trench coat that I'm going to put on him later. Just because I was kind of thinking about, him and his sort of melty quality, is he's like, shrinking a little bit too, right? He's kind of disappearing, almost like melting away. And he's just kind of in these big baggy clothes almost that were too big for him now. Scary moments here. Entering out into that white space, the brim of the hat. Did I go too far? Is it enough? Always questioning. Very similar to painting without a sketch too, right? Like you don't have these established boundaries that you're just kind of coloring in. So you're always second guessing yourself. How far do you need to go? Did I push it far enough? Now building out the top of the brim of the hat here, starting to get an understanding for the shape of it. Watching it back is always so interesting because, what comes out on the canvas or the steps at which things come out on the canvas is so different than what you've already kind of constructed in your mind. Like, in my mind, obviously, as I'm painting this, I probably have like a very clear sort of idea of how the hat should look. But as it's sort of appearing, it's like, oh my gosh, what are these shapes? What kind of crazy hat is this that he's wearing? But I can already see incongruity that maybe I didn't understand or didn't recognize immediately as I was painting it. Obviously, on the right side of the painting, that brim has to be much, much thicker to balance out what's happening on the left side there. It'd be interesting to see if I fix that. But again, leaving this little open area here because that's where I want the most sort of light to be coming through the fabric of the hat. a little bit of warmth there to just show that there's, maybe sunlight or something beaming down onto the hat. And it's just leaking through a very slightly porous fabric. But here I am. There we go. Good job, Andrew. Extending that hat there, realizing that there's some incongruity there. Maybe it was a plan, actually. Maybe I knew it all along. I can see it, now I understand what I'm doing. I'm building it out so I can bend the hat brim up and put the highlight there. So maybe that was the plan from the beginning. I'm going to say it is because makes me look better. But yeah, painting it out, just giving myself, the boundaries really. And, whenever you stop the brush, you're kind of like, you stop it and you look, okay, continue, look, continue, look, always checking to make sure you're not, deviating too far from what your idea might be. Here we go, extending the hat, I guess. Probably thought it wasn't big enough. Which I'm assuming that's like the natural way to sort of make the mistake probably is like, you're probably apprehensive, so you're probably not making things as large as they should be. Huge common thing for people painting portraits, right? Where, we have this understanding that the eyes are way up high on the head. Somehow we've developed that, probably because we're thinking like hairline to forehead. Our idea of the head stops at the hairline sometimes, and then hair is like its separate own thing. But really important to understand and recognize and think about the fact that the skull, that's continuing underneath the hair, right? So there's some part of it that's protruding up through the hairline. It's not that you get to the hairline and it just goes straight back, right? Like Frankenstein. So yeah, very easy to make the head shorter than it needs to be. Now you can really see when I put in this lighter value here that effect of the light peeking through the fabric of the hat really works pretty well there. Interesting to see. I'm going to resolve the front of the hat. Probably just a, bend in the brim and a super bright highlight on the brim there. Again, are we being super realistic here with exactly how everything's going to work out? If it were like a real scenario setup, probably not, right? Because I bet we're not getting enough reflection from the top of the forehead here in the shadow area from the light bleeding through the fabric of the hat, right? There would be some reflection up to those to that light source peeking through the brim of the hat there. But again, one of the most important things to always think about while you're painting, especially realism, your job as an artist, obviously it depends on who you are, but generally speaking, at least my philosophy, no matter who you are as an artist, no matter what you're painting, your job is not to be a perfect printer for, reality. Your job is to make the best painting that you can make. And a lot of the times, those two things can clash with each other. So, for me in this instance, keeping that shadow dark across his forehead outweighed the importance of having that light peek through the brim of the hat. Sometimes you want to keep that highlight up on the top of the hat. So sometimes you want to keep two things that are competing with each other in reality. And, it's just so cool that as a painter, you get to do that. Right? You can experience things that, or depict things that maybe are not quite exactly how they would work out. And also the highlights in the eyes, would that actually be there, exactly there? Maybe not, right? Maybe you would lose that. But it creates such cool sort of visual interest that, no reason that you can't add that. But now looking at it, the size of the hat feels pretty reasonable, feels pretty good. maybe that transition between that highlight area and the rest of it is not quite what I wanted, but still opportunity to mess around with it. Or maybe as you fill in the rest of the highlights, it kind of settles in appropriately. So a lot of the times, if you don't have all the information, some things can look off when they're actually right. And then here, building out that sort of curve of the front of the hat there, and generally looking at this, it's pretty cool how the shape of the hat came out. Kind of like the activity in it, the sort of organic quality of the way the hat is sort of worked in, almost like it's been worn a bunch, or there's life that's been spent in that hat. And color of the hat was another question that I had. I think to keep it contrasting with the color of his skin, I made it a lot brighter than I remember. So the costume, I should say, basically came from references of the original sort of introduction of the character way back when, and I can't remember the exact color that he was wearing there, but I'm pretty sure it was purple, perhaps. And I could have done that, but I don't know. I felt like, first of all, this is a much more realistic interpretation of the character than that previous version was, obviously. And the purple trench coat was like, it felt very attention grabbing. It felt very separate from the sort of aesthetic quality that I was looking for in this painting. So I decided to pick, a very much more traditional kind of color for the outfit, which is going to be more of like just a neutral, bright, off-white kind of color. And here, building out a sort of another little detail area, which is just a band across the hat, very typical of this kind of style of hat. I would say that, I don't know that I achieved exactly what I was looking for with this hat. Because I was looking for the old school Hollywood kind of vibe, LA, maybe fedora. I don't know if it is actually, but here it's looking a little bit more wide brimmed, maybe sort of like approaching cowboy vibes a little bit, which I was not going for, but I think it's not so much that it's like weird, But yeah, overall coloration, I'm pretty happy with those choices. Channeling again like the greenish quality of the original character, but adding some elements of the warmer new character in there. Here we go. The height of the hat, right? That's a real tricky part. How high do you go? Feels pretty tall, just painting it out of the blue. So definitely one of those treacherous areas reaching up into nothingness. And obviously, because this is so facing the light, it's the most, facing the light source part of the whole thing. Definitely the brightest area of the whole painting, the whole portrait. And compositionally, pretty interesting how you can balance that out. Like, is it because you might think like, well, the brightest area of the portrait of the painting is going to draw people's attention the most. And, obviously my intention is not to have everybody stare at his beautiful fedora up there, right? I want them to look at the face. I want them to see the expression and all those things that I, had originally intended, that I worked hard to kind of produce. And I think, by virtue of its placement, and it's sort of framed within layers of brightness between what's going to be the trench coat and the hat, that I think it works out it works out pretty well. And because it's so bright, again, another key to painting, we all know it, like the shadows can be very transparent, and everything that's in the highlighted area can be more and more opaque. So definitely here, big kind of general opaque area, great chance to put in heavy, thick paint. And the quality of painting with thick paint, the reason that it's so good is because it's so reflective, right? You get so much more reflection off of it. The color is not being interrupted by the surface underneath, right? You're not getting that transparency that lets the surface underneath dull the color. So you get so much more vibrant results if you're painting very thick. Or eventually, you're glazing or layering up to that point where it's pure color coming through, pure pigment coming through. Then here, as the hat kind of punches out on the brim, it's going to get brighter and brighter and brighter, right? Because more light is going to be reflecting off of it. Really, it's, you kind of feel like a detective sometimes painting from your imagination, because you're always thinking about, what, let me like build the scene out, right? You're kind of like guessing what's happening where, like what would happen in real life, kind of setting up, well, if this hat was, under this light condition, how much is it going to be reflecting? And, figuring out where everything is going to be, where all the little sort of intricacies of shadow and light are going to be. Fun game to play while you're painting. Continuing out here, and thinking about that secondary light source that's on the side of the face, right? Mimicking it on the hat. Obviously, you want to make sure that they look like they're existing in the same space and affected by the same things in that environment. So very subtly cooler highlight here on the side of the hat than on top. Helps establish that there's those two very different light sources. Same thing here on the other side. And again, super thick paint really helps those highlighted areas stand out. And I know I've said it so many times before, but depth in your painting, is created by so many things. And I always think of it as being really dependent on three things, right? Number one, the values, of course. We always say values. And then color temperature as well, right? The shift in color temperature really helps you get a good sense of depth. And then also texture, right? The sort of thickness of the paint really it's amazing how much it can do for you. That variation between transparent shadows and thick highlights. Because you're not really changing it that much, right? I mean, the thickest layer of paint you can put on versus like the thinnest, that difference isn't so great, but it's really incredible how much it just affects the final painting. Zoom out. You can see it was actually I fooled you, bigger painting than it first led on to believe here. So more space to fill out than I did have. And I'm going to start continuing on working on the clothes now, obviously. Pretty interesting to look at it now as the full canvas is displayed here. How much, what the centering is, the composition, and how maybe the way I started the painting influenced the shape and the positioning, the pose of the character, because it's slightly off center. Maybe turning, like I said, there's that sort of cool body turn in the pose, helps bring the composition together within the canvas, even though it's slightly off center like that. Anyway, zoomed out, I can really start to feel, and I guess with all the highlights built in there, you really start to feel the effect of all those highlighted of the expression on his face, right? Really kind of starts to read to me like, questioning, thinking about things, um, tragedy, hit by tragedy. That slightly open mouth, the eyes sort of very open with a slightly furrowed brow in the middle, slanting inwards, right? If the middle of your brow, or sorry, the middle ends of your eyebrows go up, it's worry. If the outside goes up, it's anger, right? So kind of definitely approaching the more worry expression than anything. And, talking about that Hollywood vibe that I was looking for, definitely feel like I'm starting to get that sense of it. The hat probably too big, but definitely fits that vibe a little bit. Even the kind of hat that it is, right? The color of hat. I just feel like I would see that in old school Hollywood pics or something like that. Yeah, building out the trench coat here, and again, starting with the dark areas like always. And I think like I said before, the trench coat is purple on the original character. I'm sure his whole costume was purple, and I think I'm probably questioning: do I keep that? Do I not keep that? But like I said before, I don't know. Because this is so much more of a realistic interpretation, I think I want to, maintain that more realistic approach to the trench coat. Building out his neck here, I always feel this is one of my afterthought areas sometimes, because if I ever paint a portrait, obviously I'm starting with the face first, and then you spend so much work on the face and you realize, oh man, I've got this whole neck to do. So sometimes I definitely generalize or abstract the neck a little bit more. But that works to, that serves a purpose too. You could excuse that by saying, well, it's not the attention getter. It's not the focus. So you don't want it to be super hyper detailed beyond what's on the face itself. Definitely, let it lead to the face. Don't let it grab away from the face. And, looking at it, evaluating it, already pretty happy with the results, with the way that it looks. Kind of cool. Yeah, maybe the one sort of error or a thing that I could have done differently is made it pushed more in the clay direction, right? It's a little too human, maybe. Even though that's sort of the point of the character that I was trying to get, I feel like I could have pushed it probably a little bit further than I did. But yeah, obviously the neck is not going to be perfectly clear as well. His whole body, I imagine, is, in this sort of clay condition. So the neck also has to have those, bumps and drips and globs on it as well. And that secondary light source, of course, also have to carry that all over the painting. Because if you don't, then you're removing things too much from reality. You start questioning, whether things are mistakes or not. Yeah, one of my favorite characters, though. Very cool. If you've never seen that animated series episode with Clayface, so good. Really, really good. Formative for me as a kid. I remember seeing that. Very the drama of it was so impactful to me. And also the animation in there was so cool. I remember there's a scene where he's experiencing his whole career, and he's got all these TVs playing different things on it, and he's looking at them all, kind of going through his memories, and his face and his body are shifting and changing into all kinds of different things, different people and different versions, and it's just a great sort of animated scene. Very cool. Probably a development moment for me in art as well, right? Definitely something that sticks in my brain from when I was a little kid. More highlights, bringing out the form, the chest kind of coming forward a little bit, the collarbone. Being very thick with the paint and sort of, a lot of painting, a lot of like proficiency in painting comes from your manipulation of the brush, right? How you're using the brush and the feel that you have for how it's sort of interacting with the canvas. And one of the things that I've noticed a lot in teaching is that people tend to have a very uniform way of approaching the canvas with the brush and putting the paint on the canvas in a very sort of simple, one-dimensional way, right? You think, this is how you do it. Similar to like, a pen where there's not a lot of, I'm probably maybe a bad example because there probably is a lot of manipulation to it, but you feel like there's generally one way to kind of use that thing, right? The line is so thin that it interacts with the paper, in pretty much the same way every time. And, the brush is so different. It's shaped in such a way, it's closer to like chalk or like, crayons or something like that, where you can really manipulate the shape that you're getting of the stroke. You can manipulate how much color, how much of the medium is getting onto the canvas, and different pressures create different results as well. So being able to kind of really get comfortable with how you're using the brush, huge key to kind of developing more in technique. So with a lot of those highlights, boy, I've yapped for so long that whole thing is long past and we've totally moved on from it. But when I was dragging that highlight across the chest there, it was very thick paint and it was very lightly in parallel to the canvas, dragged kind of down. And that helps kind of like spread the highlight a little bit more in like a sort of gives you separation, stuttering in the stroke almost that, creates these sort of, unintentional details that that just pop out by virtue of the way that you're putting the paint on the canvas. Another, by the way, huge tip that I very specifically remember running into while teaching not too long ago is, a lot of the times if you're putting paint on the canvas and let's say you're painting on top of other paint, sometimes you start pulling off more paint than you're putting on, and you feel like, oh, how do I get more paint on, right? I've put so much paint on and I want to put more on. I want to change it. And I'm painting alla prima and not waiting for it to dry. So when I interact with the brush on the canvas, I'm constantly pulling paint off. How come? And a lot of the times it's due to like two simple, very basic kind of easily corrected things that really you should be thinking about no matter when you're putting the paint on the canvas, whether there's already paint there or not. And number one thing is like the load on the brush, right? A lot of the times people, especially if you're mixing as you go, the tendency is to like mix very teeny tiny, eensy weensy amounts of paint. And because you're like swooshing the brush around, you're not grabbing a ton of paint and then really mixing it together. Basically, you want to speed the process up, right? You feel weird about sitting there like mixing forever. You want to get to the painting part of it. So you kind of speed things up a little bit by using very small amounts. But the reality is you should mix a bunch of paint, get a lot on the brush that can then be laid down onto the canvas. So the other thing is that, people are oftentimes spreading paint. Like their thought of how to paint is you've got the color and then you're spreading it across the canvas. And one mental kind of shift that you can make that instantly makes you a better painter, I feel, I experienced that when I was starting, is rather than thinking about spreading the paint on the canvas, you're thinking about laying the paint there, right? You're just placing the paint on the canvas and then separating with the brush. That's a huge helpful tip, I think. It helps disturb that problem you may have of pulling paint off right? Because you're essentially scraping the paint off. But if you're more parallel with your brush against the canvas and you're just laying the paint down, so much better results that way. Also helps you paint thicker, right? And makes you get used to painting with more paint on the canvas. Because, painting it's about putting paint on the canvas. It's not about taking it off. And it's not about making it less in certain areas. And if you're constantly brushing and scrubbing and scraping and stuff like that, really what you're doing is you're just moving the paint around that's already on there. And at a certain point, you're just thinning things out across the whole painting. And my style, the way I think paintings typically look better is when they're very thick. There's like a very good representation of the actual paint on there. And, you can see the brush strokes in there. And the brush strokes are sort of working with the whole sort of quality of the painting itself. And you're not, scumbling and smoothing everything out to like a very sort of uniform texture across the whole painting. That's when I start to, something in me loses some interest when everything is very uniform on a painting. It's that thing where like the far away quality, like you're looking at the painting from a distance, and it may work out that very well that way because I don't see I don't get a sense for, how it was painted. And then when I go close up to it, I find it very uninteresting when everything is very connected to each other in a very uniform way. I say that as a very big generalization. There's definitely plenty of times where I think paintings are like that and they look awesome and they're very cool. And even looking up close, they can look cool. But just as a sort of general rule for myself when I'm thinking about painting, the thicker I can get, the better I feel like most of the time. Now here I am painting the trench coat, obviously having some issues. Does it look like a trench coat? I don't know. I think I have some idea of the lapels, but so it does look a little bit weird. Definitely probably could have used a reference there, but I think I eventually, I worked it to a point where I get the idea of the trench coat, and it makes sense to me. And also pretty interesting. I remember like thinking about the costume as a whole, and I not really sure, how I ended up on it, but I think I thought about it without a shirt underneath. Like it's just this like, he's normally this mass, this glob, and he's just covering up to kind of, pretend to be human for a little bit or something. Sort of almost add to the tragedy of his story there. So I almost, it feels oversized. It feels, very like just thrown on in a way, just like he's wearing a costume in his real life, Now the background, I kind of decided because I left that purple out from his costume, what a great opportunity to introduce it here in the background. Plays off of the green of his skin so well, I feel, and really kind of calls back another subtle kind of indication of the character, or another subtle, call out to the origin of the character, where his costume was originally purple. And for this background, I'm actually using, one of my favorite paints, which can be a kind of a tricky paint, or a difficult problem child paint. And it's dioxazine purple, which, like I was talking about phthalo blue, has this kind of prismatic quality to it almost. Prismatic is probably like such the wrong word there. It's so hard to like describe exactly what I mean. I'm sure it has something very specific to do with the pigment itself, like the actual pigment used to make it. But something is like, I get a metallic feel to it. And I feel like it reflects very cool. There's some magic going on there with this color. So I love painting it in the background. Definitely adds a really interesting texture separation between it and the other and the rest of the painting. Can be a problem color because sometimes, obviously it's dependent on the brand a lot of the times, but sometimes it's one of those colors that can just feel like it never dries. Like you'll be picking up pigment from it for forever, it feels like. And it also, I feel like it tends to dry. It changes more than other colors as it dries. It has a sinking to it sometimes, and probably and darkens as well, definitely. But really beautiful color, though. Really beautiful color. Kind of the best, like dark purple, pure pigment that you can find. One of my favorites to use. Very vibrant, dark but vibrant. Those are great colors, and it's difficult to find sometimes where they're still very dark in value, but their vibrancy really shows through. And right now, as I'm painting it, it's very subtle. I do want something other than a flat color in the background. So I am kind of imagining this sort of like halo kind of light coming from his body, like imagining this is a horizon level, and it's going to be light sort of around his shoulders and then darkens as it progresses upwards. That's sort of generally this thought that I had as I was painting it. But really right now, just trying to get coverage, right? This is like, you see the difference in application here from this and the portrait, where the portrait I was painting all these very tiny, small areas. And in that, you don't really need any sort of additives to the paint because you're covering such small areas. You get enough paint on the brush each time to cover what you need. But here, it's like very different, huge areas that you want to cover very quickly, lots of erratic, kind of chaotic brush strokes, and maybe even some solvent mixed in there just to make sure the paint can flow a little bit easier. And yeah, now here, I'm trying to very subtly, just with a few strokes, give us that indication that it's glowing a little bit behind him, just to kind of separate even more the character from the background. And a little correction here. Rip. Again? Come on, Andrew, get that correct. That's another problem with it. It's a very staining color, so it can really bleed into that white there, for example. Some final, thick, single stroke highlights, and it's done. What a relief. But yeah, overall, very kind of fun painting to do, very enjoyable to paint. Painting without a reference from your imagination, super, super freeing. You feel like an artist when you're doing it. Sometimes you feel like a manual laborer if you're just copying things all the time. And, a really great creative experiment that I suggest everybody tries. So that's that. I hope you enjoyed this video, painting with me. Maybe it'll be like a chill kind of series that I make, every once in a while, one of these videos of, just sort of chill watch along kind of paintings of, old paintings that I've done that I can now release full length videos of, a full process, and just kind of go over them. And maybe, in the future, I'll be a little bit more on top of it, maybe a little bit more research, because in the middle there, I don't blame you if you fell asleep, because it's hard to constantly talk about something for hours on end. But yeah, super fun for me to make this kind of stuff and rewatch, very interesting. I probably have never rewatched this, to be honest. First time ever rewatching this, than from painting it the first time. So very cool to kind of experience that, play the observer role. It's very interesting. But yeah, thanks so much, and I hope to see you again in the future.